Hello and welcome to this video on Beliefs in Society, Secularisation 01, Arguments and Explanations 4. Wilson defines secularisation as the process whereby religious thinking, practice and institutions lose social significance. Secularisation could be seen to take place within a society in a number of different ways, including a decline in religious practice, people no longer believing, the influence of religious organisations such as the church declining, churches having undergone internal secularisation, and that there is religious pluralism, diversity and fragmentation in contemporary society. In terms of a decline in religious practice, in 1851 the Census of Religious Worship in the UK estimated that 40% of the adult population attended Church of England services on Sundays. By 2018, this was now less than 2% of the adult population. And so we can see here there's been a clear decline in religious practice amongst the adults of the United Kingdom during this period. Next, people seemingly no longer believe in religious ideas. In 2018, 52% of people identified as having no religion according to the British Social Attitude Survey, compared with just 31% in 1983. So once again, a big shift in a relatively short period of time. Another way secularisation could be understood to have occurred is that the influence of religious organisations, in particular the church, thinking about the UK, has declined. Talcott Parsons posits that structural differentiation has played a role in secularisation. This is the process of specialisation which was brought about by industrialisation. So in the past, religion, and in particular the church, used to perform a whole range of roles within society. It used to perform functions such as educating people and caring for the sick, the ill or the very poor. Today, however, we have specialised institutions such as the NHS or education that does this instead. This has led to disengagement between people and religious institutions like the church, that is, they're simply not engaging with it on a daily basis anymore, and ultimately has led to a privatisation of religion. Instead, people don't necessarily openly demonstrate their religiosity or actively engage with religious institutions. They are far more likely to worship, if indeed they worship at all, at home in their private lives. Fourthly, churches have undergone internal secularisation. So we're focusing once again here on the West, where churches are the main form of religious institution, places like the UK. Religious institutions have been forced to move away from more traditional doctrines and concerns with the supernatural. They've watered down their beliefs in order to survive and to appeal to more people who might otherwise be put off by the more kind of esoteric and extreme beliefs. Herbert called this secularisation from within. So for example, churches now feel they have to accept cohabitation, homosexuality, divorce, and the ordination of women. This is seen as kind of normal in contemporary, more progressive, liberal society. They also downplay doctrines on things like miracles and hell, because again, this tends to scare the average individual or worshipper off. In the USA, membership and attendance of churches was high, but because traditional doctrines and supernatural aspects had been played down. Instead, being religious was seen as part of the American way of life. Bryman also talks about the Disneyization of religion. That is, religion has been diluted, simplified, trivialised and sanitised, and it's far more now about entertaining people in order to try and keep customers, as it were, sitting in their pews and turning up every week, for fear that they might run away if the ideas are too scary or are too boring. Finally, in Western society, there is now religious pluralism, diversity and fragmentation. So religion has become fragmented into vast and diverse ranges of competing religions, beliefs and organisations. We no longer have a single belief system or a monolithic belief system. There's lots of different types of belief systems out there, all competing for customers, competing for people to buy into them. Bruce says there is no longer one main church or body of shared religious belief around which people can unite. Instead, we have religious pluralism, lots of different types of religions, all competing. Aldridge says that the very fact of religious diversity introduces doubt into people's minds. That is, they start to think to themselves, well, how do I know what I believe is the right thing to believe? Maybe that person next door or that guy down the street, maybe they're the ones who've got the right belief system. And you can see this in the growth of religious sects, cults and the New Age more recently. Religion is no longer able to provide a single universe of meaning or act as a social glue binding people together, because once again there is no single belief system, but a multitude, a diversity, a fragmentation, a pluralism of religions and belief systems. Having understood how secularisation might manifest itself, we now need to consider potential explanations for secularisation, one of which comes from the work of Max Weber and his argument for rationalisation. Rationalisation is the process in which rational ways of thinking and acting have come to replace religious ones, and we need to understand this in terms of a timeline. Go back to the medieval world, where the Catholic worldview was the norm within Europe at the very least. What happened was that the populations of Europe tended to see the world as an enchanted garden. That is, they believed that God and other spiritual forces like angels and demons were actively present in the world around them, influencing the course of events of humanity and the human experience. Humans believed, or the people of Europe believed, that they could influence these angels, these demons, and even God through magical means. They would do things like wear charms, they would say prayers, they would chant, and by doing these things they were hoping to ward off evil and attract perhaps God's love or angels to protect them, this sort of thing. Whereas today, in the post-medieval era, especially as we've reached into modernity, we now have a more modern Protestant worldview, which sees God and all of the kind of divine beings as transcendent or existing above and beyond the world. In this sense, God created the world, but doesn't actively get involved in it or intervene in it. He leaves it to the laws of nature. So it's not for people to try and divine God or to get angels and demons to be involved in their lives. Instead, everyone takes a more rational viewpoint of we've been left alone, and it's the laws of nature which govern things. It's us who are making the decisions, and this is far more rational in the eyes of Weber. The Protestant Reformation, therefore, can be seen to have squeezed out magical and religious ways of thinking, and it started off this rationalisation process that Weber's talking about, leading to the dominance of more rational modes of thought. Events are no longer explained as the work of unpredictable supernatural beings, but as predictable workings of nature. All that was needed to understand them, therefore, is rational thought, something like science. A good way of understanding what Weber is talking about is actually through the work of Bruce and his arguments for a more technological worldview that most of humanity now hold. So this technological worldview has replaced religious or supernatural explanations for why things happen. So people are now unlikely to regard bad events that occur as the work of an evil spirit or as God's punishment, but instead they seek scientific and technological explanations. A technological worldview leaves little room for religious explanations, which only survive in places where technology is the least effective. So the parts of the world which are underdeveloped, which we don't see lots of technology and science and rational thought, we can understand why those tribal societies that may live in those parts of the world still cling on to the magical world or the enchanted garden of the medieval era. Although science does not challenge religion directly, it has reduced the scope for religious explanation. A second explanation for secularisation could be social and cultural diversity. Previously, close-knit rural communities of the past have given way to looser, more urban communities. In doing so, we have also seen a change whereby collectivism, putting the group before the self, has now given way to individualism, putting the self first. We now live in a modern, multicultural, multi-faith society where we are surrounded by alternative ways of living and, of course, alternative belief systems and religions. All of this serves to undermine the plausibility or believability of religious ideas, and thus the identification that people might have with a particular religion, church, or religious organisation. However, religion can actually be a source of identity on a worldwide scale. Just living in a multicultural society doesn't necessarily mean that you're cut off from your religion. A good example could be the Jewish diaspora around the world, who hold on to their religious beliefs even though they may live in a society where they are in fact in the minority. Some religious communities are entirely imagined communities, that is, they exist purely through the use of global media and in particular the internet. So you have, for example, online covens that exist on Instagram. Pentecostal and other religious groups have in fact flourished in impersonal urban areas, rather than died, as perhaps these ideas would suggest that they should. A final explanation concerns the work of Berger and religious diversity. He identifies how in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, in particular in Europe, held an absolute monopoly on the truth or on religious truth, and there were no challengers to this monopoly. But since the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation, the number and variety of religious organisations has grown hugely, each with a different version of the truth. And simply by there being multiple versions of the truth, this can lead individuals to think, well, they don't actually know what the truth is, they may be fearful of choosing the wrong truth, and therefore may decide to choose no truth at all. Or they may pick and mix their truths to kind of put together their own religious doctrine or belief system, or indeed meta-narrative. Berger argues that this religious diversity undermines religion's plausibility structure. Basically, it becomes unbelievable. Alternate versions of religion enable people to question all of them, eroding those absolute certainties within religion that existed in the past. It therefore becomes difficult to live in a world containing a large number of incompatible beliefs without concluding that perhaps none of them are wholly true. However, Berger has in fact since changed his views on this particular idea and now believes that diversity and choice can in fact stimulate interest and participation in religion. There are good examples with regards to evangelism in Latin America and the New Christian Right in North America, which shows religion's vitality. Beckford says that coming into contact with opposing views can actually have the reverse effect and reaffirm belief for the faithful. And perhaps we can see this in examples of religious fundamentalism across the world. So thinking back to those earlier statistics on church attendance, which is declining in the UK, and non-belief, which is growing in the UK that we saw, it is useful to do a small comparison with another post-industrial, post-modern society such as ourselves, such as the United States. Brian Wilson did some work in 1962, and he found that 45% of Americans attended church on Sundays. However, he believed that this was because for many Americans they saw it as an expression of the American way of life, not because they really were deep-seated believers. He argued that actually America was becoming more secular despite that high 45% attendance figure, and in fact what happened is that religion was something superficial. People wanted to be seen to be religious, even though often they didn't actually hold strong convictions. Kirk Hadaway had a similar kind of premise in terms of his research. Opinion polls suggested that 40% of Americans were attending church regularly, so he concluded that means that churches all over the land should in fact be full. He gathered a team of people to go and do head counts at churches on Sundays and discovered that actually there were lots and lots of empty pews. So the reality did not match what the churches were saying in terms of their attendance records, and this shows that not only were the churches exaggerating, but the churchgoers themselves were exaggerating their attendance. There was an attendance gap. And so this seems to support the work of Wilson, that people may in fact see religion as something that they want to be seen to be doing, even though they might not necessarily hold enough conviction to want to attend every week. So, looking at both the UK and the US, we can bring this all together and we can posit and summarise the secularisation debate and argument with the work of Bruce, who says this: whether we measure church membership, church attendance, the popularity of religious ceremonies to mark rites of passage, such as weddings and baptisms, or religious belief itself, we find there is a steady and unremitting decline. So all evidence seems to point to the idea that religion is actually in decline, and that this is a normal process that's going to continue way into the future, at the very least in the West, in kind of democratic capitalist states. That's it. Thank you very much.